Welcome to Train Signal. You're watching a lesson on network tools. So in this lesson, we're going to, you guessed it, look at a bunch of network tools. Now, why are we going to look at these network tools? Well, because it's very important that to be a successful network administrator, you have to know what tools you have available to help you to do your job. So let's go ahead and take a look at them now. So the first tool that I would like to talk about with you here is something called a cable stripper. And although there's a picture of a generic version of a cable stripper, and that's all it does is it strips the outer insulation off a cable when you're getting ready to terminate it into a connector. You may recall, and I'm actually going to show you again in a little bit, that the type of cable stripper that I use is a little bit different than this one. Okay, so that's one thing I do want you to keep in mind, even as we're going through this entire lesson, that the tools, although I'm going to try to show you as many of them as I can, either in picture form or if I have an actual one here, they don't always have to look exactly like what you're seeing here. Okay, they come in many different shapes and sizes. So the general idea here for a cable stripper is it's just that. It's going to strip off the outer insulation of a cable, typically when getting ready to terminate it into a connector. The next one would be something called snips. Snips are used to, well, simply cut your cables. Okay, so we're not just trying to cut away the outside, we're trying to cut the entire cable. Some people refer to this tool that you see in front of you as a wire cutter. Same thing, or a cable cutter. A lot of different names. And again, the type that I used was a little bit different. I actually use a tool that's kind of a multi-purpose tool. And you may also recall from the lesson where I terminated the Cat5 cable that when I needed to cut the wires inside of the cable, I just used good old-fashioned scissors. Okay, so again, it comes in many different shapes and sizes. Now here's a tool that's a lot closer to the tool that you saw me use in that other demonstration, and this is called a crimper. A crimper is used to attach a connector onto the end of a cable. And this particular one is what looks to be, it looks like this one is a dual purpose for either a Cat5 Ethernet cable. It looks like there's also a smaller hole for your RJ11 connector for your standard telephone wire. As a matter of fact, this picture right here, this particular crimper looks like it also has a razor blade on it to where it also could be considered to be snips, where it can just cut the wire. Okay, so what I want to do now is I'd like to show you, I know you've been looking at some pictures as I've been talking to you about different tools. I want to show you a couple of actual tools that I have with me here in my office and I use on a somewhat regular basis. I mean, it's not like every day, but I've used them every now and again. Now, the first tool here is one that you've seen before. And of course, I'm assuming that you've already watched the lesson where I show you how to terminate a Cat5 cable. But this is a crimper. Okay, I mean, that's the main purpose of this tool right here. And right here, the RJ45 jack, okay, if you remember from that lesson, basically when you're terminating that RJ45 jack onto the Cat5 cable, once it's all in place, you shove it in there and you crimp down, and there you go. It's been crimped or permanently attached to that cable. Now, there are different versions of these crimpers. Some of them are just a crimper. Some of them will have a feature where you go and you can click to a certain number of clicks based upon how specific you want to get with the cable. But what's neat about this particular one is that this, although it's a crimper by definition, if you saw it on the shelf at the store, this is a multi-purpose crimper. All right, there's a couple other purposes here. This is also a stripper. Okay, so you remember we talked about strippers just a few minutes ago, and it's also a cutter, or what I refer to as snips, wire snips. Okay, and so what I want to do here is I want to try to zoom in. It's kind of hard to see. There's a reflective surface here, but let's see if I can get this zoomed in here. Basically, there's a couple of words I want you to notice. Right here, it says stripper Cat5, and then there's a little hole there. And the idea behind it, if we were to open this up, is if you put the Cat5 cable in there, and then you squeeze this down, and you just basically spin this or rock it back and forth, there's a blade in there, and it's just enough to go ahead and strip away the outer coating of that wire. But the rest of the wire would be left in place, and as far as the actual copper wires, the twisted wires inside. And then up here it says cutter. And again, you still have this razor blade, but now the razor blade goes all the way down to the base, just this base that we have right here. And again, the idea is you put the wire in, and boom, now you have actual snips to cut the entire wire. All right, so that's the crimper. And I will tell you, just a quick reminder when you're thinking about tools, when it comes to tools, is don't get caught up on, oh, that's exactly what it should look like. I mean, remember, in that other lesson, for snips, okay, for wire snips, I used just regular office scissors to cut those wires. I didn't even use this particular tool. All right, so don't get caught up on the specifics of what a tool looks like. Now, the next tool that I'd like to show you is something called a cable tester. All right, now, cable testers come in many different shapes and sizes as well. This is actually a fairly inexpensive one, and it just has basic cable testing functionality. All right, it actually has three main purposes that this particular cable tester can do. First of all, there's a couple of RJ45 jacks here. And before I even explain how we use the RJ45 jacks, I will tell you that this particular tester also has an adapter. I don't have it with me right now. Matter of fact, it's been so long since I've worked with coaxial cable, I don't even know if I know where that adapter is. But it had an adapter where you can change these ports. You basically plug in an RJ45 jack, and then you have a BNC connector on the other end if you wanted to test your coaxial cable. But saying that we're just working with regular Ethernet Cat5 cabling, you have these two RJ45 jacks, and the idea behind it is you plug one end of the cable into one, another end of the cable into the other. There's a test button that you can hit, and what it's doing is it's testing to make sure that you have a good working cable, right? Because it's closing the circuit and it's communicating the way a Cat5 cable should. It also has the ability to make sure that you are wired properly. Let's say you just created your own Cat5 cable. Make sure you're wired properly for a straight through versus a crossover cable. Now, one other thing I want to point out on this particular device, and again, we're going to try to zoom in here, and hopefully it's you'll be able to see this, is there's a couple of words that they have listed up here. Okay, so it says remote and loopback. Now, it's not that big a deal to pay attention to these two words when just testing a cable. But if you want to test a cable that, let's say, is in the wall, right? In other words, maybe it's going from a server room or a room that has a patch panel, or it has your switches and routers and whatever, and it's going out to office space, right, where all the people sit, and you can't see that cable. You can't just pull that cable out of the wall. You want to test that particular cable. Well, then what you do is you put one end of the cable into the jack where it was labeled remote, and then, let me go ahead and put this device down for a minute. There's a second half to this device. What you do is you put the other side in, or really, I will tell you, I mentioned putting the cable in. If it's a patch panel, you might need to get a cable, plug it into the patch panel, plug it into that remote port, now go out to the jack out by somebody's desk, plug in a cable, and plug the other end into this remote device, and then a tone can be sent between the one device and the other. Okay, so we have our two devices here. We send a tone between the two to, again, test and see if that's a good working cable or not. Now, I mentioned that there is actually a third function to this particular tester, and it's only part of the function. And it's something that we'll talk about in just a moment here. And that is, there is the ability to generate a tone. Okay, so this can go ahead and generate a tone. Okay, it's a tone generator. So if you were to just go ahead and plug in to, let's say, your patch panel on one of your cables that's, again, running through the walls, and you want to see where the break in a cable is, or just even figure out where that cable goes, if you were to get a toner probe, so I don't have the probing aspect of this, I only have the generator side of it. It's generating out a signal. If you get a toner probe, you can actually probe along the wall and follow that wire. All right, so that's just a couple of the standard tools that I always keep with me because it comes in quite handy. Being able to terminate a Cat5 cable always comes in handy, and being able to test the cable comes in handy. Now, the one last thing that I want to talk to you about before we go back and look at some other tools is that there is a version of the cable tester which is also sometimes referred to as a cable certifier. Okay, and that's a form of cable tester that will actually have certain ratings to certify the cable as being rated to a certain level. Okay, just so you can understand, if you ever hear that term, cable certifier, it's not only testing that it's a good working cable, but it's working to a certain level. Now, what I showed you is probably the most common tools that you're going to use. And when I say you're going to use, meaning almost any network administrator is going to use some form of crimpers, cutters, strippers, and cable testers. But now we're going to get into some more specific types of tools, and ones that would be used either by a more advanced network administrator or maybe somebody who's a little bit more specified in a certain area. As for instance, the first one I have here is a punch-down tool. A punch-down tool is used to connect wire to a punch-down block. Right? We saw this in another lesson where we have like a 110 block. Very often this is where you'll have telephone wires, and you'll use this punch-down tool to literally kind of punch those wires into their connection, into the wiring block. And again, this is typically going to be something that's used by somebody who's working more in the telephony arena of networking. Next, we have a TDR, which stands for Time Domain Reflectometer, or I always like to call it the reflectometer. However you want to pronounce it, a TDR is used to check the continuity of a copper cable. And since the TDR is used for checking the copper cable, an OTDR, which is an optical time domain reflectometer, that is used to check the continuity of an optical-based cable, or what we learned to be fiber optic cable. Okay, so in either case, we're talking about checking the continuity of a cable, whether it's copper or fiber optic. What these tools primarily are used for is to help locate where there is either a break, or I will tell you, sometimes it's not an actual break, but a breakdown in a cable. In other words, if you have a cable that's not giving you the performance that you're looking for, or in some cases, it could be completely dead, but it's a long run of cable, and you don't want to have to necessarily pull out the entire cable, this can help you to find where that breakdown or where that break is. Perfect example is I had a scenario once where a cable was not performing up to the caliber that we thought it was supposed to. And it was this long run that went behind a whole bunch of desks. Okay, there was a whole bunch of desks in a row. And I will tell you, being an instructor, this was actually in a classroom. So there's a whole bunch of desks in a row, and it's really difficult trying to get behind all of these desks and figure out what's going on with this cable. So using a tool like this, we were able to find out that it was able to say, okay, your issue seems to be approximately, and this is, I don't remember the exact numbers, so hypothetically we'll say it was 20 feet in from where this cable starts, right? We have this cable, we start from one point, boom, 20 feet out. That gave me the ability to know which desk to pull out away from the wall and look at that cable and see what's going on. And sure enough, the desk that was about 20 feet along the wall, the leg of that desk, and it was a big, heavy desk, was actually resting on the cable and therefore crimping it. And not crimping it like when you use a crimper to terminate the jack in, but crimping it, as in pinching it down into the floor. And so what we found out was that we simply were a little bit more careful about pushing that desk back, and sure enough, our cable was good to go. So this tool helped us to not have to pull the entire cable out and then put a whole new one in, or at least recognize where the problem was and then put it all back. Now, I don't have a picture of one here because I will tell you that these tend to be a little bit more advanced. And when I talk about how all these different tools come in different shapes and sizes, this one really does. Very often, this is a tool. It'll have some form of connectors, and it'll have some form of a readout screen. But beyond that, there is no one specific way that this tool looks like. Now, the next tool is something called a toner probe. And a toner probe is used to locate the end of a cable. Okay, so if you have kind of the beginning of a cable in one place, this can be used to locate where the other end is. Now, this is not that far off from the cable tester that I showed you before. Okay, in other words, a toner probe and a cable tester lots of times can be one and the same, in the sense that the idea behind the cable tester that I was showing you before was essentially using the toner probe aspect of it, where we can go ahead and generate a tone, right, when we connect into, let's say, the jack in the wall in a given office, or maybe where a desk is going to be, and then we go over to the patch panel over in a server room and check to see, which port on that patch panel we get that live reading from. Okay, so this is very often if you have unmarked jacks. The example I gave with the cable tester is that the jack was actually labeled, and so we just want to make sure, has it truly been wired, and are we having a problem with that cabling? Whereas here, maybe it's unlabeled, so we plug in the tone generator on one side in the office, and then we go over to the patch panel and just start using the probe on each port on that patch panel until we get a tone and we get a reading saying, oh, all right, there we go, we're connected. Now this next device, called a voltage event recorder, has to do specifically with the electricity aspect of things, okay, and very often this is not even considered to be a network administrator's tool. Okay, this has to do specifically with monitoring the quality of power coming out of a wall outlet. The only place that this really has to do with you as a network administrator is, well, when you're wanting to plug in a network device, you want to make sure that you're plugging it into a good outlet. Many people will test that by just simply plugging it in and seeing if it works. The next device here, again, more typically used by an electrician than a network administrator, but it's called a multimeter. And a multimeter, again, has a lot to do with testing the electrical aspects of outlets and the power aspect of a device. But the difference between a multimeter and maybe some of these other electrical-based devices is that, well, look at the word, multimeter. It tests a variety of information about your electrical connections. Now, the last so-called literal device, the literal tool that we're going to talk about here is something called a butt set. A butt set is used to allow an administrator to butt in onto a communication line. And if you look at the picture that I have here, this is something that you, depending on how old you are, may have seen back in the old days. You'd see the telephone repairman using a device like this to clip into the telephone lines and butt in to see what kind of a connection there was. Now, I mentioned that that was the last of the literal devices as far as when it comes to networking tools. But now we're going to talk about some other types of tools. And the first one we have here is a protocol analyzer. Again, in this case, the reason I'm not going to have any pictures for you for these last few here is because there truly is no literal. Very often this can even be a software tool, not just a hardware tool. So a protocol analyzer is used to, well, you'll never guess it, analyze network protocols. Okay, it'll go through and it'll see how a given protocol is functioning and see if there's a breakdown in that protocol's communication. We have a temperature monitor, or some people will refer to this as some form of like an environmental monitor. And the idea is, I could just say it's a thermometer. The idea is it's monitoring the temperature and humidity. So, it does go beyond just a little thermometer. I mean, we can say thermometer and then also humidistat. And there's other aspects of the environment it can measure. And we use this typically in a server room to make sure that it's maintaining a certain temperature and humidity level. And it can then alert an administrator if there is some kind of either A, drastic change, or B, even if it's not drastic, maybe it has crossed through a certain threshold. Right? So if you know your server room has gotten to be too warm, send off an alert so that the administrator can see what's happening before you fry all your servers. And the last device that I want to talk to you about here, this actually does go back to being more of a hardware-based tool, but again, they come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and that's a loopback plug. It's sometimes also referred to as a loopback adapter, and the reason I've included it in this last section, even though it can be a hardware device, is it also can be set up, believe it or not, through software sometimes. Okay, so this loopback adapter is a connection device that is plugged into a computer's communication port, and what it does is it performs a loopback test. Throughout this course, we've talked about different things when it comes to testing communication and troubleshooting communication problems. Well, part of that can be this thing called a loopback test, where you just simply see if the computer's communication port is functioning properly by emulating communication. All right, so that takes us to the end of this lesson, and basically we went through and we looked at a bunch of network tools, or more specifically we could say tools that you would use as a network administrator, and that should help you to successfully do your job. Don't know what else I can tell you other than I'll see you in the next lesson.